The mud of the Euphrates River was cold against his skin, a sharp contrast to the scorching afternoon air that had baked the Iraqi landscape just hours before. For the young sniper, hidden in the shadows beneath the bridge, the world had become a narrow tunnel of focus. He could hear the chaos above the heavy thud of combat boots on concrete, the barked radio transmissions in English, the guttural shouts in Arabic. He was 19 years old, a boy from a small town in the Midwest who had been in country for only 3 months. He had joined the Navy out of high school, a mix of patriotism and a desperate need to escape a future with no prospects. After grueling training, he had earned his trident, becoming a SEAL. Now, he was lying in freezing water, waiting to die or to kill. The mission had seemed straightforward at first. A routine reconnaissance operation near a strategic crossing south of Baghdad. Intelligence had suggested insurgent activity, a possible staging ground for ambushes against American convoys. The SEAL team had inserted under the cover of darkness, moving silently along the riverbank to observe the bridge. For 2 days, they had watched. They saw nothing but the usual foot traffic, farmers with donkeys, women carrying bundles of laundry, children splashing in the shallows. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic. But the young sniper, peering through the scope of his Mk11 Mod 0 rifle, had learned that peace was often just the silence before the storm. On the 3rd day, the storm came. A platoon from the Army's 3rd Infantry Division rolled up to the bridge in a convoy of Humvees. They were conducting a sweep, clearing the route for a larger supply column. The sniper watched from his height as the soldiers dismounted, their movements practiced but tense. They approached a group of civilians on the bridge. He saw the civilians raise their hands, then slowly back away. It was a textbook interaction. Then, the world exploded. From his position in the water, the sniper saw the first rocket-propelled grenade streak from a culvert on the far bank. It slammed into the lead Humvee with a deafening crack, the vehicle erupting in a ball of fire and black smoke. Instantly, the air filled with the staccato rattle of AK-47s. Men who had been posing as farmers and shepherds threw off their disguises and produced weapons from beneath their robes. The ambush was perfectly laid, a killing zone on the bridge with no cover and no escape. The sniper watched in horror as American soldiers were cut down in the first few seconds of the assault. He could see a staff sergeant, his arm a bloody mess, pulling a wounded man behind the burning wreckage of a Humvee, returning fire with one hand. He heard the frantic radio calls for help, the screams of the wounded, and the chilling, triumphant cries of the insurgents. For a long, agonizing minute, the young SEAL was paralyzed. His orders were clear: observe, do not engage. He was a ghost, not a savior. To fire his weapon would be to give away his position, compromising not only his own life, but the entire reconnaissance mission. He watched as another RPG struck a second vehicle. He watched as a young soldier, no older than himself, tried to run for cover and was hit in the chest, his body crumpling to the concrete. He could taste the bile in his throat, a mixture of fear and a burning, helpless rage. He tightened his finger on the trigger, then eased off. He thought of his own team leader, a grizzled veteran who had taught him that patience was the deadliest weapon of all. Wait for the shot. Don't let the enemy dictate the fight. But the fight above him was being dictated entirely by the enemy. The insurgents, confident in their victory, began to move. They swarmed out from their hiding spots, converging on the bridge to finish off the survivors and collect weapons. The sniper heard one of them shout in broken English, a taunt directed at the dying Americans. "Mission complete! Mission complete!" He screamed, mimicking the radio transmissions he had likely intercepted. The other fighters laughed, a harsh, guttural sound that echoed off the water. They believed they had won. They believed the only Americans in the area were the broken souls on the bridge. They had no idea that death was watching them from the water dot in that moment. The young sniper made a choice. He knew the risk. He knew that by firing, he would likely sign his own death warrant. The moment he broke cover, the entire force of the insurgent squad would turn on him. There was no extraction coming. There was no cavalry. There was only him, his rifle, and the cold water seeping into his bones. He thought of his mother back home, of the letter she had sent him that was tucked into his vest, the one he promised himself he would read again when this was all over. He took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill his lungs, and cleared his mind of everything except the crosshairs. The first insurgent he targeted was the one who had done the shouting. He was standing on the edge of the bridge, his back to the river, an AK-47 held loosely in his hand as he surveyed his handiwork. He was a perfect target, silhouetted against the smoky sky. The sniper exhaled slowly, his finger taking up the slack on the trigger. The report of the rifle was deafening in the enclosed space under the bridge, a sharp crack that seemed to split the world in two. The insurgent's head snapped forward, and he collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, tumbling over the railing and into the river with a heavy splash just feet from where the sniper lay hidden. For a heartbeat, there was silence. The gunfire on the bridge faltered. The insurgents looked around, confused. They had heard the shot, but it hadn't come from the bridge. It had come from the river. They rushed to the railing, peering down into the murky water and the deep shadows beneath the span. They saw nothing. The sniper had already shifted his position, sliding silently through the water to another piling, his movements practiced and silent. The SEAL team leader had once told him, in a firefight, the first one to move loses, but the sniper knew that in this fight, staying still meant losing too. He had to be the water itself, fluid and impossible to grasp. The second shot came from a completely different angle. Another insurgent, leaning too far over the railing, was hit in the shoulder. He spun and fell back onto the bridge, screaming in pain and shock. Panic began to set in. The hunters were being hunted. The insurgents opened fire blindly into the water, their bullets churning the surface into a froth, but the sniper was already gone, having slipped beneath the surface and surfaced again behind a thick cluster of reeds further downstream. He was a ghost, a myth, a creature of the river rising up to claim them, the SEALs on the far bank, who had been watching the ambush unfold with the same gut-wrenching helplessness as their teammate, saw their opening. The enemy was distracted, terrified, pouring fire into an empty river. The team leader gave the order, and the remaining SEALs opened up with everything they had. The precise, controlled fire from their M4 South and the heavy thumping of the team's sniper support weapon ripped into the insurgents from the flank. Caught between an invisible assassin in the water and a sudden, deadly assault from the tree line, the ambush began to collapse. The teenage sniper, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird, continued his grim work. He picked his shots with cold precision, each one a prayer for the fallen soldiers on the bridge. He saw a young man, no older than himself, taking aim at the SEAL team on the bank. The sniper's round took him in the chest before he could squeeze the trigger. He saw another trying to drag a wounded comrade to cover. A single shot ended that effort. He was no longer a frightened boy in the water. He was an instrument of consequence, a sharp and terrible blade cutting down those who had come to kill his countrymen. He lost count of how many rounds he fired. He lost track of time. The world became a series of snapshots, the muzzle flash of an enemy rifle, the face of a man as a bullet found its mark, the slow, red bloom of blood in the murky water around him. He moved on instinct, on training, on something deeper and more primal. He was survival incarnate. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The surviving insurgents broke and ran, fleeing into the date palms and irrigation ditches, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire had been. Filled with the groans of the injured and the crackling of the burning vehicles on the bridge, the SEAL team moved cautiously to the bridge, securing the perimeter and calling in urgent medical evacuations. The sniper remained in the water for a long time, his body shaking uncontrollably from cold and the massive adrenaline dump that was now receding. When he finally emerged, dripping and pale, his teammates looked at him with a new respect. They had seen what he had done. They had seen him reverse the tide of a massacre. The staff sergeant with the ruined arm, Jamie Villafane, was being loaded onto a stretcher when he saw the young sniper walk up. Their eyes met. The sergeant, weak from blood loss, just nodded once. It was a nod of profound and unspoken gratitude, a recognition between warriors that transcended words. The sniper nodded back. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt hollowed out, empty. He walked over to where a chaplain was kneeling beside a covered body. He didn't know the soldier's name, but he knew he was from a small town somewhere, just like him. He had a mother somewhere, just like him. The sniper reached into his vest and